Good evening, everybody. And it is absolutely lovely to see so many of you here. This is the first event that we have organised for the Friends of St Michael. Now, if you don't know about that, this is a special organisation that has just been relaunched, and this is to support the iconic church, which I won't even, obviously, you all know, up on the tour. So, if you are not yet a member but would like to be a member, we are taking membership tonight. You do get a very, very fetching little badge, which is really rather good. Okay, so should you want a badge, they are rather spectacular. And we have had a number of people who have joined as a family membership. And we've had a number of grandparents who have joined, £20 for joint membership, which includes the 2 adults and 3 of their grandchildren, which I think is a rather lovely idea. And also in aid of the Friends of St Michael, we are selling these rather fabulous Christmas cards. We do have the artist with us, although I think she's hiding herself right now. But these are on sale over there at the interval if anybody would be interested in buying them. They are actually, that is a painting, they are lovely. But obviously, this is Mark's night, all right? And we are so, so grateful to Mark for what he's going to do. We're looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
In September, we were just finishing choir practice, and Debbie, off the cuff, Debbie being Mark's wife, said, "Oh, Mark's book is being published soon." Just off the cuff. And they weren't going to do anything about it. So we really couldn't let Mark's book be published and not acknowledge it. Don't you agree? Yes. We do. So Mark, we are really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, and well done. Well done.
Well, you haven't actually heard anything yet. Firstly, I'd like to wish very happy returns of the day to the King. Great to see so many friendly faces, mostly friendly anyway, apart from my competitors from the tennis club, mentioning no names, Alistair. Yeah, I got soundly thrashed yesterday. And also I see colleagues from Brent or More Compassionate Neighbours, and from the church choir. And even my brother, who does not wish to be identified. And also 2 of my wives. My current one is soon heading down to Australia, where she told me last night, but I think I must have misheard. She's hoping not to become the first woman to be kicked in the balls by a kangaroo. Yes, I'm sure I misheard. For anyone that wants any, I do have some rather hot chilies. First come, first served. Afterwards, they're called, I picked them this afternoon, they're called Raging Bull, and they're only 100,000, what are they called, Scovilles. So they're not super hot, but they're fairly hot. Okay, thanks, Friends of St Michael's, for inviting me to come and talk. Actors are always told that no good ever comes from working with animals or children. Well, I'm the same with IT, so this could go either way. Hopefully when I'm in charge, so it should be all right. So the plan is to have a break about halfway through, so you can use the facilities and recharge your glasses if there's enough wine.
There's lots of rosé. We've got 3 bottles of red and 2 bottles of white left, and some beer.
Great. Anyway, if you don't like flying, then maybe this evening's not for you. Anyway, let's crack on. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, your tables are stowed, and your seat backs are in the upright position. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. Okay, I'm going to begin by explaining how the book came about. My brother and sister and I grew up with a father who was a very private man. Like many of his generation, he was reluctant to talk about his exploits. To a small boy, flying boats seemed romantic, but also mysterious. And I mean, I don't know about some of you, but I used to love the Biggles books, particularly when they involved flying boats. But I'd never actually seen one. So in the mid-50s, I remember I must have been about 6, my dad mentioned that we might be going on holiday to Italy in a flying boat. I thought this was fantastic. And so I was really disappointed when the plans changed and I was told we were in fact going to Bermuda instead, on an ordinary plane. Thank you, Wendy. So this is where we stayed, with old friends of my father's from his days in Bermuda, which we'll come on to later. Whilst there on holiday, we met various people who seemed to know quite a lot about our dad. And there was also a newspaper reporter, but I had no idea what that was all about. In those days, back in the 50s and 60s, my parents used to host tennis parties at home. And I remember this man coming to play. He was wearing long whites. My dad said, "This chap's got tin legs under these trousers." Well, of course, I didn't believe him. I mean, why would you? Anyway, the visitor said, "Well, why don't you hit them with my racket? Here you are." And he handed me his racket. And I gave his legs a good wallop. And quite possibly a bit too hard. Anyway, there was an almighty clang. And this chap, of course, was Doug's father. Okay. So, as I grew older, I found out little snippets about my father's flying life. But he gave very, very little away. So I was in the dark for many years. In 1990, by which time he was 83, I finally managed to get him to talk a bit about his life, using a tiny little handheld cassette recorder to get some of this stuff down. He died 3 years later in 1993. His old friend Ross Stainton, with whom he joined Imperial Airways in 1933, and who subsequently became chairman and CEO of British Airways, came to see him at his bedside just before he died. When they finished talking, excuse me, they simply shook hands and said goodbye. A couple of weeks later, Ross was at his funeral, delivering the eulogy. So it was the end of an era. Boxes of papers, photos and cinefilm were stored away. And we hardly looked at anything for 30 years. Then one day in 2022, I met up with some friends in Salcombe. We poured a glass of wine and we talked. We probably had another glass. I was drawn into relating some anecdotes about my dad's flying days. They became very animated, but it may have been partly the wine. And they told me that all this had to be written down for posterity. Well, I think this just confirms that wine is bad for your health, because look at all the work that it's put me to. Anyway, when I got home, I thought, well, one of these friends was quite a well-published author, and so I thought, well, perhaps I'd better seriously look into this. So when I got home, I started to dig through the boxes, thinking that I might try and put something together, really just for the family. But I soon realised that this was a pretty amazing treasure trove. And then my brother Kit produced even more material, and I gradually began to piece together an extraordinary tale. Tom and Gary were right. This needed to be shared more widely. And so the scribbling began. Many gallons of midnight oil were burned. All the planning was done in longhand. But when the writing started in earnest, it wasn't long before I'd capitulated and the laptop took over. I put one of the labels from his work, which was previously in his office, on the door to remind me that it was my workplace. But it was cold, and it was wet, and it was winter in Brentor. But then I got lucky. Some very good friends kindly lent me a little shack in the Bahamas for a few weeks. It proved to be a wonderful place to do some quiet editing. And by the way, that's not the shack, it just made a good picture. But that was almost next door to where I was staying. And then Kit came out and joined me for a week or 10 days, or 2 weeks I think, after I'd done my editing. Okay, a little bit about the title now. When my parents met, one of the first things my mother asked was, "What do you do?" To which he answered, "I fly boats." Predictably, she said, "But boats don't fly." Well, so it seemed appropriate to call the book He Flew Boats. I liked the snappy feel of it, and I felt it would make people think. So this was my own idea for the cover. I liked the sepia, I liked the 30s feel, I liked his eyes peering over the top of the title. But the publishers, unfortunately, had other ideas, driven apparently by, wait for it, internet search optimization. So we ended up with this. Well, it wasn't what I had envisaged, but you win some and you lose some. And I thought, well, look on the bright side, at least you've got a publisher. And I do appreciate that finding a publisher can be one of the toughest challenges for a writer. So, about the title, I mean, I don't know what you think. Are you with me or are you with them?
With you.
Anyway, it's too late now, they've beaten me into submission. So here goes with a synopsis of the story. It's quite a busy one, so I'll do my best to keep it tight. Thanks. Yep. My grandfather was a planter in Ceylon, which is now, of course, Sri Lanka. So although they had a home in Yorkshire, my father spent his early years in Ceylon. He'd been christened Marmaduke Jonathan Roland Alderson. But as that's a bit of a mouthful, I'll refer to him as Rowley from now on. And that's what he's called in the book. So in 1914, when Rowley was just 7, his father answered the call to arms, and the family returned to Yorkshire, and his father went off to the Western Front to fight. He'd already, incidentally, been fighting in the Boer War. They shipped over from Ceylon with the horses in the hold to fight the Boer War, and then came back the same way. He survived, but his brother was killed out there. So, yeah, okay, Wendy, thank you. Rowley's older brother, that chap, was a young officer in the Navy. He was killed in 1917 at the age of 17. His father received a letter of condolence from the king, and you may wonder why, because this was certainly quite irregular. He was, after all, just a midshipman. In fact, this afternoon, interestingly, my brother brought me his original commission letter, which required him to attend on HMS Conqueror on the 1st of January 1916, and he died at the end of 1917. Anyway, it was a mystery, this condolences from the king, but I do throw light on this in the book. So soon after this, Rowley's mother died. She was only in her 40s. And this double whammy prompted a move from their home at Tick Hill, near Doncaster, to Shropshire. Thank you. As you can see, Gannow Hill was a spooky-looking Victorian pile, but it had one great advantage. It had a workshop and a smithy with a forge. It also had its own resident blacksmith. Young Rowley, and he was only 14, was put in charge of the family car. He was not only the chauffeur, but he was also in charge of maintenance. Under the gimlet eye of the blacksmith, Rowley built himself a little aluminium-bodied three-wheeler from scratch. This took 2 years, from 1922 to 24. It was ready for the road just in time for his 17th birthday, although you can be sure there'd been a bit of unofficial road testing in the lanes around Gano. Thank you. And that's the original tax disc, 100 years old, which explains what it is. Bent beam. He called it a bent beam because in his eyes it was a cross between a Bentley and a sunbeam. Probably didn't look much like it. Anyway, let's just scroll back 5 years to 1919. Sir Ross Smith, who some of you may have heard of, created history with his record-breaking flight from the United Kingdom to Australia. This was a light bulb moment for 12-year-old Rowley. He was going to fly. Tragedy struck yet again. His father died suddenly. So Rowley and his sister and younger brother had to leave Gano as it was to be sold. His remaining elder brother sorted stuff out, and he decided that Rowley should go to Cambridge to study engineering. That was a great idea, but there was one major problem. Due to illness, when he was about prep school age, Rowley had missed out on a secondary education. He just had a governess for a couple of hours a day, which suited him fine because he could tinker away on the forge and with the blacksmith. But it meant that as he hadn't had a secondary education, somehow he had to get up to speed to get into Cambridge. Anyway, he clambered into his little homemade machine and drove off to Cambridge, 165 miles away to the southeast. And after some concentrated cramming from a private tutor, which his brother paid for, and no doubt quite a bit of sweat, he managed to secure a place at CATS. That's student slang for St Catherine's College. He had no money, but he serviced other more wealthy students' cars to get by. And by saving and scrimping, living frugally, he managed to acquire a 3-litre Bentley, which of course he wanted to race. Here he is racing at Chelsea Walsh. So he now had 2 vehicles because he didn't sell the 3-wheeler. Anyway, he now joined Cambridge University Air Squadron, which, as luck would have it, had just recently been established. It was established in 1925, and he joined in 1927. So it was pretty young. And he had his first flight in November 1927. This wasn't the actual aircraft he first flew in. This was the one that he had his first flight as P1 a few months later. I think he only did about 13 or 14 hours before he got his license. So when he graduated from Cambridge, he was lucky to get a job with Fairey Aviation, an aircraft manufacturer. Due to the Great Depression, there were very few jobs about. Really, he wanted to fly, but there was no chance of that. So this was the closest he could get. So he continued to fly with the RAF Reserve and kept in touch with them. And he shared this aeroplane with a buddy from Cambridge, a chap called Bobby Anderson. Rowley told me when I recorded him in 1990 that Bobby was actually not a very good pilot. So Rowley did almost all of the flying. He spent a lot of time in the air, every spare minute really. And they toured Europe together in that little thing, ranging as far as Poland and Italy. They were even invited to dine with the officers of the Luftwaffe when they called in at Berlin. Fortunately, they had packed their dinner jackets. This clip was used a few years ago in a television documentary, hence the voiceover. Thanks, Wendy.
Is at Cambridge in the 20s, he was one of the first to film air-to-air. Only recently discovered, this film, never seen in public before, shows the site of what was to become London Airport years later.
Pretty good stuff, isn't it? Yeah, he filmed that. He was a very keen photographer with cine as well as stills, which is why I was lucky enough to have a lot of photographs for the book. Okay, so this was an exciting time in aviation, and a lot of pioneering was going on. Famous pilots like Bert Hinkler and Amy Johnson were constantly in the air, breaking long-distance records. And then there were people like Dennis Finch-Hatton, the hero in the film Out of Africa that some of you may have seen, and even the Duchess of Bedford, who casually took off on a 10,000-mile round trip to Karachi and back. I mean, ridiculous. Although she did take along her own mechanic. Imperial Airways was formed in 1924. The pilots were without exception ex-Royal Flying Corps. In 1933, new routes were being planned across the empire, so Imperial now needed more pilots. Rowley applied and was the only civilian pilot recruited. Almost immediately, he was sent off to Imperial's Cairo station. Here he is on the right with his regulation solar topi in his left hand. Here he's aged about 25. And this is the first aircraft he flew in as a commercial pilot, an Avro 618. One of the first jobs he undertook there was a very interesting one and very important to the UK at the time. This was a private charter flight to take Sir John Cadman and other Anglo-Persian oil company bosses to a meeting with the Shah of Persia, who was threatening to cancel the oil contract.
Special charter work. You had to be a fairly wealthy firm or maybe a royal personage to make that kind of grade. And we did go out. I can't remember the names of the 2 or 3 top people in England. But the end of, I think it was the Anglo, who had been told that the Persian government were cancelling the agreement they had for the supply of oil. And it was a very serious matter. They just wanted more money, really, as it turned out. But the boss went out with his 2 or 3 advisors, taken by us, out to Iran. And it was a place not very much used, of course, and thereby looking at a place which a lot of people would give their 80s to go and be put up at the best hotel, such as it was, for a week or 2.
Sorry about that. It was a bit laborious, but this was one of the. That's when I interviewed him in 1990 with this little cassette recorder, so hence the quality. So they were there for a couple of weeks, and by rather a devious plot devised by Cadden, the 2 pilots were directly involved in the successful outcome of the talks. But this is all in the book. It was a pretty cunning plan.
You need a microphone.
A pretty cunning plan that was devised, and let's just say the aircraft was involved in the Shah capitulating. So Rowley spent the next 3 years on the new Far East routes from Karachi across India, ending up at Singapore, flying Atalantas and HP-42s. Wait, no. And at Atalanta, that's an HP-42. So what happened was that the passengers went out so far in the HP-42s, which were big and slow but took more people. And then, as the number of passengers reduced, so they would transfer onto the Atalantas, which were a brand new type of machine at the time. Sorry. Okay. Hang on a second. So it was fascinating stuff. There were plenty of adventures. And apologies for the next voiceover. It's in a similar vein, I'm afraid.
From Karachi and across India, that was a day's journey. We had to give passengers a sleep. So it was never a non-stop right through, except in emergency conditions. So they arrived from England in Hannibal's. They got to slow things, and they spent a night there. In fact, they didn't spend the night in Karachi normally. They arrived in Karachi in the midday from somewhere else, at this end of it. And the Atalantas, aeroplanes were small, although the Hannibals were quite a number, but a lot of people went to India, no one was any further. So the airplanes got smaller, and they used to clamber onto the Atalanta in the afternoon, and we used to go to Jodhpur for the night. And they had a fairly tiring day then, but they had a good sleep in a good hotel in Jodhpur. As it was, the airport was the the Sheikh of Jodhpur's.
Maharaja.
Yes.
Interfering.
The big shot. He used to come down quite often. He was a very approachable chap. He spoke perfect English and so on.
Probably
And anything was wanted, he just made sure was bought. Radio or services and so on. It was quite a good hotel on the airport. And then the next day they would travel off early in the morning and they go through calling at 2 or 3 places like Delhi and Allahabad and so on, to get to Calcutta.
I'm sure you're glad it's over. Oh dear. Okay. This was, now at the end of his 3 years, he was tasked with piloting the Viceroy, Lord Willingdon, on his farewell tour around India, which must have been a pretty fascinating trip, visiting the various Maharajas. The Viceroy's own pilot had failed his medical, so Imperial were asked to release their best man to step in and fill the gap. So this is the Viceroy's own private machine, named the Star of India. Finally, after 3 years, it was time to return to the UK. He hadn't been back for 3 years. And of course, what Rowley had really always wanted to do was to fly boats. So shortly after he arrived home, he went down to the Hamble River to commence his flying boat conversion course. He started on this actual machine, the rather comical-looking Saunders Roe Cutty Sark. After a few flights, it was time to tackle a bigger machine. This was a Short Brothers S8 Calcutta. As you can see, it had an open cockpit, so it must have been very cold and noisy. In fact, when new, this particular machine had been landed on the Thames and moored opposite the Houses of Parliament for inspection by members of both the Commons and the Lords, including the then Chancellor, Winston Churchill, who incidentally later developed a soft spot for flying boats, but more of that later. This particular boat was destroyed in a storm off Crete just 6 months after Rowley completed his conversion course. So 4 weeks later, after some 30 hours of flying, Rowley was ready. However, there was a hitch. Imperial badly needed new pilots on their busy and rapidly expanding European routes, so he had to wait a bit longer. The machine he flew on these routes was the DH-86A Express. I think these are really elegant little aircraft. They carried up to 16 passengers. Some of you may have heard of the better known de Havilland Dragonfly and the Dragon Rapide. In fact, you can still have a flight in a Rapide if you want one. So Rowley spent the next 9 months biding his time. Then his big chance came. In July 37, Imperial started their much vaunted new service from the UK to South Africa using flying boats. And Rowley was immediately rostered onto this route, piloting the brand new Empire class boats. He wasn't given to indulging in superlatives, but even he admitted that the Empire boat was indeed a beautiful aeroplane and a great advance on anything we had, and from every point of view. From Hythe, which is where they took off, which was the English base, they routed via Marseille, Rome, Brindisi, Athens, Alexandria, Cairo, and then they followed the Nile, stopping at Luxor, Wadi Halfa, Khartoum, Malakal, Port Bell, Kisumu in Kenya, and numerous other exotic places, which are too many of them. Finally winding up at Durban. Occasionally while on this route, they met up with one of the Scipio class boats, which were being used en route survey work. This was at Kisumu in Kenya. Okay, thank you. Okay, he continued on this route, now as commander of his own boat, and this was his first command. Until early 1938, when Imperial opened up a new flying boat route from the UK through to Malaya via Alexandria, and then on to Bahrain, across India and Burma. From time to time, he continued on south from Alexandria, routing as before down the Nile and ending up in Durban. He finished this tour in April and returned to England, for there was a new challenge afoot. In May 1938, Rowley found himself in Bermuda, in command of the Empire-class boat, the RMA Cavalier. RMA, incidentally, standing for Royal Mail Aeroplane. He was the only pilot on duty there, apart from a friend of his, Taffy Powell, who was actually the station manager, and he liked to keep his hand in, so from time to time he would do a shift. But most of it, 90% of it, was done by Rowley. The Bermuda to New York run was Imperial's most prestigious service, and the only trans-ocean one. He thoroughly enjoyed his existence there. He was a bachelor, and when not flying, he made the most of the opportunities that this delightful little island offered. Swimming, fishing, golf, tennis, sailing. He even bought himself a little sailing dinghy in the States, which he brought over in the Cavalier's hold. At first all went well, but as winter approached, Rowley started to report engine issues. These problems continued intermittently, and he reported them back to London, insisting that an urgent solution was found. Here are a couple of shots showing the interior of the Cavalier. I don't know whether you can all see. On the left here, that's his shoulder just on the left. And just where I'm pointing now, you may be able to just see a whistle. That was just a little standard chrome whistle, which was used to signal the bowman when picking up or dropping off the mooring buoy, because obviously you couldn't see much from where you were as the pilot. These boats were very spacious and comfortable, affording luxurious accommodation for up to 20 or so passengers. White-coated stewards served hot meals on bone china plates, and the table was set with silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and linen tablecloths. It was very much first class, and certainly only affordable by the super rich. The issues which had been dogging the engines continued under certain atmospheric conditions. And being an engineer by training, Rowley had a very good idea what the problem was. He wrote a final and very detailed warning letter to London just before he took off for New York on the 20th of January 1939. The following morning at 10:42, after the scheduled overnight stop in New York, the RMA Cavalier took off once more from Port Washington, bound for Bermuda. Initially, the flight proceeded as normal. They were barely 2 hours into the flight, at an altitude of about 9,000 feet, when the engines began to fade. And to cut a long story short, this time they failed to recover. They sent out a pan-pan, and then eventually had to follow it by a mayday. They came down in a heavy swell, and the plane broke its back. They managed to get everyone out before it slipped beneath the waves. They were in the cold Atlantic waters for over 10 hours, during which time three souls were lost. Okay.
This time off the coast of America. Here the Imperial Airways flying boat Cavalier is ending one of her flights from Bermuda to Long Island. Alas, on another such flight outward bound to Bermuda, her engines failed and she was forced to come down in heavy weather 150 miles out at sea. Wireless told the whole story. By wireless, the position of the great liner was learnt. Wireless announced the rescue of her survivors by the American tanker S.O. Baytown.
Okay. In fact, it wasn't 150 miles off land, it was 285. But it doesn't matter, it was a long way away from anywhere. Next one, please, Wendy.
This time?
No, next one. Yeah, that's it. This artist's impression of the rescue, I don't know if you can all see, appeared in Life magazine shortly after the event. As you can see, the rescuers had quite a job on their hands, rowing out from the tanker in heavy seas. Okay, it's probably been dramatised a bit, but they did have a difficult job. The rescue was in pitch dark, in the middle of the Atlantic, and it really was a miracle that they were found. And again, that's in the book. The tanker stopped, having been told by Taffy Powell from Bermuda. He got a message to the tanker saying, "I think you've gone too far." The skipper stopped the tanker, stopped the engines. They listened out and they heard shouts. And they picked them up in searchlights. Anyway, so they arrived in New York aboard the S.O. Baytown to the glare of the world's press. This was the first ever loss of a commercial aircraft in mid-ocean. There's a lot more to this story. It's all in the book. It takes up the whole chapter. Anyway, having recovered from his ordeal, he returned to duties back in the UK. Thanks, Wendy. So I'm sure you all know what happened on the 3rd of September 1939. War was declared. On that precise day, the flying boat Clyde, seen here, took off from Poole, bound for Karachi, with Rowley in the left-hand seat. He routed by way of Saint-Nazaire and Marseille, down through Italy, Greece, Egypt, Israel, Iraq, and finally to Imperial's hub at Karachi, capital of the Sind, which was then still part of the British Raj. He continued on these routes, both to Singapore and Durban, until, with the defeat of France in May, and then with Italy joining the war in June, this was of course 1940, he ended up being stuck in Africa until October. and was really based down in Durban. And there's quite a bit about that in the book. So he returned, thank you, he returned to the UK by sea. Almost immediately he was sent down to Lagos to collect General de Gaulle in the Clyde, the boat we saw earlier, and returned him to Poole. And this turned out to be quite an eventful flight. That's all in the book.
That's a good reason for buying the book.
De Gaulle sent Cher Commander Alderson a typically Gallic letter of thanks. Then in January 1941, just 2 months later, tragedy struck Rowley once more. Rowley's only surviving brother, Gerald, together with his old flying buddy Bobby Anderson, whom you remember he shared his first aircraft with, and Bobby's wife and their 3-year-old son, who was Rowley's godson, were all lost when the Almeida Star was torpedoed by a U-boat off Rockall. Those two chaps were in the Fleet Air Arm, and they were going out to Trinidad to train on British aircraft, which is what happened. A lot of pilots were sent abroad so that they could train in safer skies. The U-boat was in fact U-96, under the command of the infamous Captain Lehman Willenbrock, who was the lead character in the film Das Boot. So you probably know about that. At this time, the UK government had just agreed to lease purchase 3 huge Boeing flying boats from the US in order to maintain the vital transatlantic link. Just a month after his younger brother was lost, Rowley was selected as one of these pilots and went out to Seattle on America's Pacific West Coast, where the Boeing factory was situated. As you can see, these were huge machines. This picture was actually signed by Harold Gray from Boeing's. The wingspan was almost as big as a jumbo jet. In fact, they were so big that a mechanic could actually walk through the wings during flight to carry out any vital adjustments. They were also tricky to fly. As Boeing's test pilot commented, keeping the aircraft straight was akin to herding a reluctant buffalo. These pictures give you an idea of the size of these boats. The hours were relentless, crisscrossing the Atlantic on a non-stop rotor from their base at Foynes on the Shannon, on Ireland's west coast, then routing out to the west of Biscay in an attempt to avoid interception by the Luftwaffe, then to Lisbon, which of course was neutral in theory anyway, then on to Bathurst on the coast of British Gambia, down to Lagos in Nigeria, then across the Atlantic to Belém in Brazil, then up to Trinidad, then Bermuda, and finally to their American base at Baltimore, 170 miles southwest of New York. Baltimore was where they were serviced, and part of the lease purchase agreement was that they had to be serviced every few hundred hours. So that's where they had to go. On the return, depending on the season, they would return either via Newfoundland direct, or in winter, because Newfoundland was iced up, they would have to go via Bermuda and the Azores and Lisbon, and finally back to Foynes again. They could be in the air for over 20 hours at a time, but at least these big Boeings, unlike the Empire boats, had heating. So finally, at the height of the war in February '42, there was happiness for Rowley. He met Jo, my mother, and that in itself is an extraordinary romantic story. 4 months later, they joined forces, but very soon it was back to work. Rowley remained on the treacherous transatlantic route for the next 2+ years. As you would expect, there were some hair-raising moments, but you'll have to find out. On one occasion, it was in fact early in 1942, Churchill returned from vital talks with President Roosevelt aboard one of the 314s. It was actually this one. This was the Berwick, one of the 314, actually a 314A, strictly speaking. The other two were Bristol and Bangor. I've been referring to the 314A because the 314, for those that are technical bent, the 314 had a shorter range, only 3,500 miles, whereas the 314A, which is what these were, had a range of 5,200 miles. And they also had a lower service ceiling, 3,400 feet, as against nearly 20,000 feet for the 314As. So we had the Rolls-Royce version. So this was on 15th of January 1942, Churchill returned across the Atlantic aboard the Berwick. The flight was later dubbed the most daring flight of the war. Churchill commented on the comfort as well as the fine food served aboard the Berwick, but they were nearly shot down twice. A squadron of Luftwaffe fighters were scrambled from Brittany to intercept them after a navigational error almost landed them on top of the German defences on the Brest Peninsula. What happened was, in fact, that they suddenly realised, as they were approaching Brest, that they were too far south. So they turned hard to port, and although they were due to go to Pembroke Dock, they had to head for Plymouth instead. Anyway, as you can see from the cartoon, the Luftwaffe failed miserably. And then, as they approached Plymouth from the south, they were picked up by our radar and were thought to be an enemy aircraft. As Churchill later commented, fortunately the squadron of Hurricanes sent out to shoot us down also failed in their mission. So finally, after 3.5 years and 500,000 miles on that route, Rowley's time on the big Boeings came to an end. As the war drew to a close, the OEC were looking ahead to renewed commercial operations, and Rowley was appointed flight captain of the line, responsible for the fleet serving the Africa, India, Australia routes, which were served by Dakotas, Yorks, Halifaxes, Lancastrians. Incidentally, the Lancastrians were fitted with 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, big 1,500 horsepower V12s, which were the same engines that powered the iconic Spitfires. It would have been great fun to fly one of those. In 1946, Rowley was put in charge of the BOEC development flight, which entailed assessing the suitability of many different types of aircraft for BOEC's post-war needs. This involved proving flights, testing these aircraft in all sorts of countries and climates. Like this. Quite a hilarious picture, I think. This was an Avro Tudor on a proving flight down to Africa in 1947. This was actually at Cairo. The Tudor turned out to be an unsuitable aircraft. It was a British aircraft, but it wasn't any good, basically, and it was rejected. The British government were desperate to buy British, as the coffers were all but empty after the war, but there was just nothing suitable. So with great reluctance, they were forced to look across the Atlantic. And ended up buying 5 of these constellations to fill the gap. Rowley continued, however, to evaluate a variety of British aircraft. Incidentally, he flew all of these aircraft personally. He didn't just go in them to see what they were like. He actually flew them all. Where were we? Constellations. Amongst others were the Handy Page Hermes and the Hastings, the Vickers Viking, and the very strange-looking Bristol Freighter. That one actually, sadly, was lost the following year after he tested it. It was lost with all the Bristol-based crew off Portland Bill. There was some sort of structural failure, and it was witnessed by a submarine crew as it came down. Anyway, so although he was manager of the development flight, as I said, he actually flight tested all of these aircraft. So as the jet age had not quite arrived, the OAC bought several other aircraft to bridge the gap. For instance, the Canadian Argonaut, a later derivative of the ubiquitous Dakota, which was used to take Princess Elizabeth to Kenya in February '52. Her father, George VI, died while she was there, and she returned on the same aircraft just a few days later as Queen Elizabeth. BOAC also purchased several Stratocruisers. This is a Stratocruiser, you can see. Sorry if I'm blocking the route, blocking the view. It's quite an interesting aircraft. It was built a bit like an upside-down 747, in that there was a VIP lounge slung underneath with a fully equipped bar in the underbelly, used by the captain to entertain any passengers he chose to invite down there. In fact, Kit will remember a trip we took over to Gander, I think it was, and we were heading for the West Indies, I think. And we were invited down there because the boss was on board. As a family, we were invited down there and had drinks with the captain. I don't know who was flying the thing. I presume he had something in the right-hand seat. He probably had a gin and tonic in those days. Anyway, meanwhile, back at the de Havilland base at Hatfield, much research and development had been going on to produce the first ever commercial jetliner. This particular aircraft was the second prototype, G52, and this was its first overseas proving trip and its first landing at Rome. This is refueling at Rome, the same trip. This particular aircraft, I've talked about. So the BOAC development, Comet Development Unit was formed in 1950. Rowley was appointed manager of the unit, which then morphed into the Comet fleet. As manager of the new fleet, he became the first commercial airline pilot ever to fly a passenger jet. And this is his team. He's in the middle at the front. As you can see, this was at Heathrow. Just in the background is the, I think it was called the Queen Elizabeth building, just under construction. So that would have been, about 1952. The Comet was a fantastic British achievement and way ahead of its time. But sadly, within the first year of commercial operations, there were 3 major tragedies, which resulted in the Comet being mothballed. There'd been some inherent structural faults, and as so often happens to innovators, by the time these issues had been resolved, and they were, the Comet's rivals had raced ahead. Meanwhile, at home, Rowley never lost his taste for technical perfection. And just like his days at Cambridge, he always did his own servicing. None of his cars ever went near a garage. So, 1955, as Rowley's position as the Comet Fleet manager was defunct, he was appointed BOAC's technical manager of flight operations. He was a very busy chap, as he was also in charge of the central training unit and advised on the operational aspects of all new aircraft types, preparing them for service, liaising with the Ministry of Transport and Civil Aviation. At the same time, he was on the navigation board of the Guild of Air Pilots and navigators, and was also on the United Kingdom Air Registration Board, which related to the design, maintenance, technical examinations, and licensing of civil aircraft. It's now known as the CAA. By 1965, all the piston engine aircraft had been retired, so Rowley was responsible for an all-jet fleet, consisting of the ubiquitous Boeing 707 and the classically beautiful, I think, British Vickers VC-10. By now, the Concorde Agreement had been signed by President de Gaulle, and one of Rowley's very last tasks at BOAC, which very soon became British Airways, was planning the cockpit layout for the British Airways Concorde pilots. He retired in 1966, having piloted 180 aircraft, including 37 flying boats, during which time he had clocked up a total of 11,000 hours, or 15 months in the air. 6,000 of those hours were on boats. In a reprise of 1930, when he bought himself a Gypsy Moth biplane for Christmas, he decided on a retirement present. Some Italian engineering. 3 years later, in 1969, to the delight of the nation, Concorde finally took to the skies. With Rowley's old pal, the British Aerospace Chief Test Pilot Brian Trubshaw at the controls. Yeah, thank you. So, a few mysteries for you. The death of Midshipman Alderson. Why was there a cover-up by the Navy? And there was. The Anglo-Persian oil deal. What was the secret role of the pilots? The Cavalier disaster between Bermuda and New York. What was the cause? How on earth were they found? And who was the real hero or heroine? There's a clue there. Winston Churchill's famous Bermuda to Plymouth flight. I bet you don't know what was on the lunch menu. And Concorde test pilot Brian Trubshaw, he had a quirky nickname. Does any of you know what it was? Well, read the book. Now, would you please fasten your seatbelts, as we will shortly be arriving back at Brentall Village Hall. We hope you've enjoyed the flight.